If you're trying to get slow motion shots and you're confused with what frame rate to shoot at and what to do in Resolve or Premiere Pro once you shoot your video, you're not alone. I was super confused about this topic when I first started out. I'm gonna help you guys out in this video and make things super easy to understand and to apply. There's really only two things that matter when it comes to shooting slow motion. The frame rate that you shoot your video at, or your camera's frame rate, and the playback frame rate, or the timeline frame rate. I'll get into both, but first let's talk about the camera frame rate. A video is literally just a bunch of photos or frames stitched together. The higher the frame rate, the more frames or photos per second. When you shoot a video, you make a choice as to what frame rate to shoot your videos at. Depending on your camera, you'll have different options, but some common ones are 24, 25, 30, 50, 60, 120, and 240 frames per second. When it comes to shooting regular video, stuff like this that you don't want to slow down, in North America, there's really only two frame rates that you're going to be shooting at, 24 or 30 frames per second. Almost all movies and stuff that you would consider to be cinematic are shot at 24 frames per second and has pretty much become the standard. And it's what I would recommend that you shoot YouTube videos at as well. In Europe, that standard is 25 frames per second. 30 frames per second is used for things like sports and live broadcast, and if you don't change the settings on your iPhone, it's what your iPhone videos will be shot in by default. When you start getting into higher frame rates like 60, 120, and 240 frames per second, those are the frame rates that you're going to be using when you're shooting slow motion. The higher the frame rate that you shoot at, the slower the slow motion shots that you can get, and I'll get into why in a minute. The big thing that you need to remember out of all of this is that for regular videos that you don't want to slow down, shoot in 24 frames per second. And if you want to shoot slow motion, shoot in 60 frames per second or higher. And if you want to shoot your footage at 30 frames per second instead of 24 for whatever reason, then just make sure that you don't mix and match the two, because your footage is going to end up looking choppy when you put it in your editor. And I'll show you why once we start editing. Now let's jump into the editor. I'm using DaVinci Resolve, but the same concepts are going to apply to Premiere Pro or Final Cut. You're just going to need to look for where you can find these specific settings in your editor. When you create a new timeline, in Resolve to do this, you can just right click and create a new timeline. You're going to be prompted to choose the timeline frame rate. This is where I got confused when I first started making videos. You want to match whatever your base frame rate is. What I mean by that is, if you're shooting in North America and you're shooting at 24 frames per second, and then you have a bunch of higher frame rates like 60, 120, 240, stuff that you want to slow down, then your timeline frame rate should be 24 frames per second. Again, if you're in Europe and you shoot at 25 frames per second, and then you have some higher frame rate stuff that you want to slow down, then your timeline frame rate should be 25 frames per second. If your base frame rate for your normal video stuff is 30 frames per second, then you're going to want your timeline frame rate to be 30 frames per second. If you're just trying to create one slow motion clip, then set your timeline frame rate to 24 frames per second. To create a slow motion clip, simply drop your 60 or 120 clip in the timeline. I have a 60 frames per second clip here. When you play it back, it won't appear in slow motion, and that's because you need to actually change the clip speed. In Resolve, you can right-click the clip and select Change Clip Speed. You don't want to just pick a random speed here. There's actually some math to this. You want the playback speed to be some multiple of your timeline frame rate. In this case, the timeline frame rate is 24 frames per second, so you want to slow down the clip to either 24, 48, 72, 96, and so on. Reason being is that by doing so, your clip plays back smooth. So to slow down your 60 frames per second clip to 24 frames per second, your clip speed should be 40%. And you could see that it plays back smooth. You can also slow it down to 48 frames per second or 80%, and that will also be smooth. If you choose some other speed, not a multiple of your timeline, it'll be choppy. Watch if I change the clip speed to 50%. The clip is slowed down, but it's not as smooth. The same kind of thing happens if you drop a 30 frames per second clip into a 24 frames per second timeline. It plays back a little bit stuttery, and that's why I said not to mix and match the two frame rates. The same idea goes if you have a 120 frames per second clip, except obviously the math now is just a little bit different. And it also means that you can slow down your clip even more now, this time to 20%. 240 frames per second, again, you can go even slower. Now, if your timeline is 30 frames per second, the same concept applies, except now you're slowing down your clip to some multiple of 30 instead of 24. It may sound confusing, but really there's only like 3 numbers that you need to remember. For me, I shoot all of my normal stuff at 24 frames per second. I shoot all of my slow motion stuff at 60 frames per second. So my timeline is always set to 24 frames per second, regardless of if I have slow motion stuff or not. So for me, the 3 numbers I need to remember are 24, 60, and 40%. One more thing to note about footage in general to make it look as smooth as you can possibly make it. Make sure that you're always shooting with a shutter speed that's equal to twice your frame rate. This is referred to as the 180-degree shutter rule, and it makes the motion look as natural as possible. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, then your shutter speed should be 1/48, or because most cameras don't have that, 1/50. If you're shooting in 60 frames per second, then your shutter speed should be 1/120. What this typically means is that if you're shooting outdoors during the day, then you're gonna have to be using an ND filter or a variable ND filter, otherwise your footage is gonna be overexposed. It's just the way it is. An ND filter is pretty much a necessity when it comes to shooting videos, and this is why. Okay, my favorite part, or my favorite question that always comes up when it comes to shooting slow motion. What happens if you accidentally shot your clip in 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second, and now you want to slow it down? Now what? Well, in DaVinci Resolve, I literally just made a video, and in it I explain exactly how to do this, and you can check that out here.